postgraduate conference towards the end of June 2016, and it's entitled "Working with the Shadows," as hopefully will become quite self-evident in terms of why it's called this in a second. Just some initial thoughts, really. I think one of the questions that I think we need to keep coming back to on a regular basis, but almost to a certain extent I wonder to what degree we don't, is the whole idea about why, what is it we're trying to achieve with education, and education in the widest sense, not just schooling, although that is an important part of education. And from my own perspective, also not only schools but universities. And I think that this is certainly a very pertinent question within the HE sector. It, I think, goes without saying that education over the last 20 years has become increasingly driven by managerialist principles, new public managerialism particularly, and this is also becoming more and more true within the HE sector. But what's interesting about education being driven in this way is that actually many of the notions of managerialism now are generally outdated. They're notions that aren't prevalent within sections of the private sector. Notions of how companies should be run in some sectors has started to change quite a bit, and therefore, as per usual, what we're actually doing is actually living in some ways behind the curve within education. And also, one of the other sort of main elements really in the way that I'm certainly thinking at the moment is that really that managerialism, that attempt to micromanage everything, particularly through data, is really an attempt to not only understand what's being done, that's obviously important, but also to control it. It's an attempt to always feel like we're fully in control in the way that we manage something like education. And as a consequence, in that attempt to manage, what we've seen is an increasingly reductive set of approaches to education in the way that it's run. And here I just offer a couple of short quotes to sort of just really in a sense define what I mean by reductionism. So that whole idea that we can understand the world as a whole series of sort of separable and independent units, and that they all have linear cause-effect relationships. In other words, that we can identify simple cause and effects and then somehow easily measure them, and as a consequence we feel that we know them extremely well, even though in many cases we don't. Obviously many people almost ad infinitum have talked about the neoliberal turn in education, but I think there's a very interesting way in which this can be considered, and really is the jump off point for the presentation that I gave. And obviously there's been a lot talked about the sort of rise of individualism, that actually the nation state has very much become the market state in many ways, and that underlying that is a belief that competition in the free market is what is most important. And sort of this has been just a mantra really ever since the 1980s under what I would call Blairo-Thatcherism. And actually the fulfilment of academisation and the free school policy initiatives could actually just be seen as the next step within that neoliberal move, with the bringing in of private concerns, the fact that there have been a number of cases where people have been charged with fraud because actually they're sort of muddying the waters in terms of contracts, etc. And there's a lot going on that actually sort of shows this sort of competitive and market orientated drive within education. And even outside of England, we're obviously seeing the rise of very large international private educational concerns who are constantly lobbying to have a greater degree of the market. But I think one of the problems that we as humans have is that if we change something over a period of time, we tend to normalise it. And therefore, in many ways, neoliberalism for many has just been normalised as the way the world is. And we lose sight of the fact that this is actually just part and parcel of a wider, really quite radical socio-economic experiment since the 1980s. That's essentially what it is. It's an experiment, and there seems to be rapidly gathering evidence that it's running out of steam and has ultimately failed. In fact, I would argue that we're at the beginning of the long death of neoliberalism in many ways. But an interesting perspective, and certainly one that I'd not come across, but actually I think really does resonate, is the work of Chandler and Reid, who have written a book called The Neoliberal Subject. Absolutely fascinating book. And one of the things that they sort of talk about is this idea of the neoliberal narrative being one of the world being harsh, it being unforgiving, and therefore the individual has to prepare themselves to live in such a harsh world, a competitive world. And we begin to get the use of terms like resilience and ability to adapt as being traits of those people who can survive in this kind of climate. But what's interesting is that as they quote from Collas is the idea that you're not allowed to imagine anything else. You have to live within that mean competitive world. You have to show resilience. You have to show an ability to adapt, because actually to do anything else is wrong. And as is put here, Collas has shown that the liberal war on humanity's psychic powers of imagination has effectively entailed the will to pathologise all political utilisations of the imagination as fanatical and mad. In other words, if you imagine anything other than the neoliberal perspective, then that is severely problematised. You as an individual are problematised. And therefore it begins to stop people imagining that there can be something different. And certainly within England at the moment, much of the media plays a pivotal role in ensuring that those close boundaries to the way that we think are patrolled and kept coherent and intact. And therefore, what we've actually seen, certainly over the last decade, it started in the 80s but has really come to fruition in the last decade, is actually an education policy, wider social policies that are inherently social Darwinistic, based on compliance, on reductionism, on resilience, and through reductionism quantification, we begin to see education as a way of putting forward this narrative of resilience, of ability to adapt, of competition, of getting ahead. And even though it's sold at the moment by the government as being about social equality and getting ahead and aspiration, it's actually socially Darwinistic in many ways, I would argue, in character. And it's driven by numeric data in terms of accountability. Accountability structures are reductive. It's all about the numbers. And research, or the research that is deemed to be important and is listened to, is likewise driven through reductive, number-driven research, such as that done by the EEF, etc. And therefore, we begin to grow narratives of efficiency rather than effectiveness. And there's also the driving out of professional autonomy, which is all about sort of making sure that teachers don't have, if you like, in a sense, a power base of their own, that they're kept subservient, they're kept busy, they're kept in a position where they're constantly having to react. But that's done whilst also trying to create some kind of positive narrative about how wonderful it all is. And the way that professional autonomy is driven out is by this idea of social acceleration, Virilio's idea of dramology, where people are constantly shifted from one thing to the next, that they're reactive rather than proactive, We've talked about already the idea of managerialism, but also as a consequence of that dividuation, where actually for some within the system, the humans themselves are no more important. They're split from the data that is related to them, and it's the data that's important. Because we are not allowed to think outside of the neoliberal fold, you begin to get teaching support networks, mindfulness and support networks and growth networks, and sort of trying to constantly talk about how to keep ourselves safe and how to keep ourselves fit and healthy. And this is totally understandable, and I wouldn't criticise those structures other than that they play into that neoliberal narrative of not imagining the other. In other words, we keep telling ourselves that we can sustain and be resilient and be happy, even though the environment around us is absolutely appalling. And actually what it does is it makes us not actually try and alter the environment. We don't try to imagine how the environment might be different. We just find ways of being positively resilient, so nothing actually changes. There's a destruction of alternative voices. I've anecdotally heard of schools where teachers have to table questions 24 hours before a staff meeting to ask a question. You can't have alternative voices. You can't have alternative ways forward. There's a corporatisation that is beginning to sweep across parts of the English education system. And we have reductive ontologies, notions of best practice, outstanding lessons, and the idea of really a business capital approach, which is that idea that it's hard work, you have to work at it hard, but as long as you use data while it's hard work, it's not actually conceptually that difficult. Therefore, I would argue that in many ways we've ended up with a system that works with the shadows. We begin to see the data more than the children, not at an individual level perhaps, but certainly systemically, certainly in some areas of education it's the data that matters, and sadly at higher education level now you tend to hear a lot more talk about things like national student surveys than you ever used to, because actually the data is more important than the students in many ways. We tell ourselves that we can control the process of education, we can control the process of pedagogy through creating lots of frameworks, lots of best ways of doing things, but actually that's very much a Meccano approach to education, and a belief that if you just take every little facet and bolt it all together in a particular way, somehow ultimately we can make it perfect. And the idea that all education has to be efficient. We have to have efficiency in everything, even if that dehumanises us. Sort of the idea that we can't let kids talk between lessons because we might lose 30 seconds, and if we lose 30 seconds 5 times a day, that's 2.5 minutes, and eventually if they're there long enough, then this will just be catastrophic for their education. So great, we become more and more efficient, but actually to what end if we lose our humanity in the process? And there's vocal denunciation of everything other than the official narrative of education. There's denunciation in formal spaces by politicians and allied agencies. There's denunciation by outriders in informal spaces, and certainly on social media, where if certain people step out of certain assigned areas of discussion, or if they see the world in a different way, then they're pounced upon. There has to be a denunciation of the other, of imagination. And therefore what we end up doing is simplifying and ultimately just describing ideals of ourselves. We reduce the complexity of the processes involved in an attempt to control them, but we reduce them so much that we end up controlling either the wrong thing or things that don't actually in reality exist. And this is what I mean by us working with the shadows. Rather than working with the complexity and the people and the communities, etc., what we end up doing is working with the shadows of those in an attempt to simplify and control. Therefore, we have to start imagining something different. We have to start offering alternative models and processes and ideals. And this seems particularly pertinent given what's happened in the last sort of 3 or 4 days with the vote to leave the EU within England. And therefore we need to voice our imaginations. We need to create different futures. We need to create different narratives. And what we need to begin to do is to stop picking over the carcass of neoliberal work. If people still believe that neoliberal approach is the best thing there possibly can be, we're probably not going to convince them by now that it isn't. What we need to do is stop looking so much at that over the last decade, over the last 20 or 30 years more widely in social and economic policy, there's tended to be this belief that somehow you have to work within the neoliberal narrative, and to an extent that's true. You know, politicians over that period who've tried to narrate outside of that narrative have been very severely treated, particularly within the media, who actually have been complete outriders for the project. But what we need to do is to begin to spend far more time, leave that to one side. We need to create and verbalise and debate meaningfully and critically alternatives. We need things that work, not pie in the sky, this sounds wonderful, or wouldn't it be great if. It needs to be more down to earth, it needs to be thought through and coherent and evidenced. And where possible, whether that's in single seminar rooms, classrooms, courses in universities, etc., we need to begin to embody some of these alternatives wherever possible to help further build the evidential base. And this is important as Milton Friedman, however much I disagree with his economic theories, I think he's completely right here. This central quote that people have used a number of times before, that only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. And the idea that when the change comes, it comes from the ideas that are lying around. Something different. I think a starting point here is the work of David Snowden and the Cynefin framework. This is really more within sort of business and organisational studies and a very practical framework that's used within predominantly the private sector and government agencies. But back in 2007, in quite a short paper that he wrote for the Harvard Business Journal, I seem to remember, he talks about this idea that systems organisations can actually take the form of a number of different systems, from simple through complicated, complex, chaotic, or undefined. But simple systems quite often are invoked, and increasingly invoked, within education. And it's this idea that somehow there are clear cause-effect relationships everywhere, that really we just need to collect enough data because it's all fact-based management, that actually what happens within schools organisationally and pedagogically is consistent, and therefore what we need to do is put the proper processes in place that are defined through data, and as long as we do this, then actually we'll head towards the notion of best practice. I would argue that education in general, schools as organisations, certainly universities as organisations, and much of the pedagogy that goes on within them, to describe them in this way is a categorical error, because I would argue that actually we're talking about complex systems, both in terms of leadership and management and in terms of pedagogic process. The complex system argues that actually there's flux and unpredictability. You know, we 10 years ago could probably never have guessed that the education system, particularly in HE, would be where it is now. It isn't just consistent over time. There's lots of changes, lots of policy changes, lots of contextual changes. 2 years ago, when the Chinese economy began to slow down, suddenly some universities started finding that their international student numbers were drying up. That creates a different environment for them to lead and manage under. And it's actually, rather than about fact-based management, it's actually about pattern-based leadership. Complex systems aren't random, they're not chaotic. It isn't that just things are spinning around in an incoherent way. There are patterns. to complex systems, and it's about leaders understanding and picking up on those patterns and using those as the mainstay of their work, and accepting that there are many competing ideas perhaps within organisations in terms of how we might want to teach particular topics or particular subjects, and therefore what we need within a complex system is creative and innovative approaches, and therefore the way that these organisations need to work, the way that we can begin to develop pedagogy really well, is actually through interaction and communication rather than collecting data all the time. Data is still important, but it's actually the interaction and the communication that goes on within the organisation which is really, really important. And as a consequence, rather than talking in terms of best practice, and I would say not only in terms of organisation but within pedagogy, to talk about best practice is a categorical error. All we can talk about is emergent practice, the idea that we're constantly refining and bringing new ideas and new insights. We're teaching different groups, we're leading different groups, we're managing different situations, and therefore our practice is just constantly emerging over time. We would start from the premise of imagining something different, as seeing education as a series of interpenetrating complex adaptive systems. Complex adaptive systems being characterised, as I have done here, through the work of, say, someone like Cilliers, where we can actually begin to talk about a number of characteristics that certainly seem reasonable within an educational context. The idea of a large number of elements with many interactions. Think about a seminar room, that's certainly true. There's many elements, both human and non-human, where there is a huge amount of interaction in so many different ways, but actually they're non-linear, that actually large-scale causes can have small-scale impacts and vice versa. You can spend ages producing a new module that you think is going to be brilliant, and actually it still moves people on but doesn't have a radical impact, whereas you can be talking to one individual for 10 minutes and suddenly a light bulb goes on. That actually there are feedback loops, that education is full of open systems. No school is a hermetically sealed closed system. There's policy, there's community, there's information, there's 1,001 things coming in and out of that particular system. It's very open. And therefore the school, the elements within the school or the university or the classroom, they're actually interacting with the environment. So actually sort of saying what the bounds of the lesson are is very, very difficult, because actually prior learning's coming in, students are interacting in different ways, interacting perhaps with each other or with the teacher. There's a whole series of different elements going on. But at the same time, as I say, complex systems aren't random. They have histories. We can look back and understand patterns, and that may give us some notion of what might be happening as we go forward. But actually, we can't predict very easily with complex systems. We can't predict as we go forward in either any detail or very far ahead. For the kind of things that I think are important in beginning to think about how we reform educational systems. First of all, that accountability systems, yes, they need data, but they shouldn't be data driven. That actually they should start from the twin points of trust and responsibility, that we trust teachers, we trust lecturers, we trust students to actually do a really good job. But actually in giving particularly teachers and lecturers some of that autonomy back, some of that trust, we make it very clear that brings with it responsibility and a more holistic set of responsibilities. Also that we begin to sort of slow the tempo of change rather than constantly ramming new initiatives all the time into education. We have fewer of them so that there's not a perpetual state of revolution, but one where the system evolves and emerges. It has time to assimilate and consider and move forward in a considered way, and that we get rid of the notion of teacher development. In many cases this has just become a form of enforced change. It's not that you as a teacher can actually decide where you think your career needs to go, or knowing your own practice, what you think might be most useful, it's often now tied to data, and you're enforced to change in particular ways. So rather than teacher development, I think we need to think more holistically in terms of teacher growth, around sort of a whole series of different facets of teacher work, both in and beyond the classroom. And we need to get back to seeing schools as part of wider communities, not just communities by themselves. And obviously a lot of schools already do a huge amount of brilliant work with their local communities. But I'm even talking at the level of how our schools look. It amazes me that, particularly in England, we actually have schools that look, in a sense, look more like open prisons. They have 8-foot high metal fences. They have swipe things to allow you through doors. How that then sets us up as being at the centre of communities, I don't really know. And universities likewise, as they go headlong into this sort of neoliberal commercial headlong dive, one of the things that potentially is beginning to happen is that they're loosening their ties with their communities. They're loosening their ties with the people around them, which in a civic sense is dangerous, some more than others, obviously. And therefore, what I would argue is that we need to have something where a narrative and dialogue drive the system. Data's important, data has to be there, but it shouldn't dictate the process. Narrative and dialogue amongst the people within the organisation, with lots of communication, lots of transparency, so that everybody has a stake in how the organisation moves forward, should be right at the centre of what we're doing. And this isn't sort of a fluffy, just sort of, we'll open up schools and everybody can do what they want. I would argue that knowledge, certainly within the curriculum, both in schools and universities, knowledge has to be absolutely central to what we do, but it needs to be taken further. We need to think about conceptualization. We need to build understanding. We need experience, both from outside and within the school, to be core elements of what we do. And we need to see the academic as both cognitive and embodied. In other words, the English baccalaureate at the moment, I think, is tremendously damaging, because it marginalises things that are deemed not to be traditionally academic. It's damaging. When you see how much skill, time, effort, reflection, writing goes into GCSE or A-level art, when you see all of the things that go on in those other subjects, which are just as important for the growth of human beings, to marginalise them in the way that they've been marginalised, in my opinion, is criminal. We need a more holistic approach to the notion of academia. And therefore, we also need a curriculum which looks forward as well as back. I have serious reservations about this idea of the best of what has been written and said, because actually in many disciplines it's difficult to actually come to agreement on what that means. And in a sense is quite arbitrary and is in many cases backward looking. We need something that looks back. Our culture, our history, our geography, etc. are all extremely important, but we need a curriculum that looks forward as well. And within all of that, the idea of assessment really is a network rather than a hammer. Assessing in different ways, assessing at different points, assessing in imaginative ways, and not just seeing assessment as something that you have at the end of a course that you do in very traditional ways, and sort of say to people, well, this is it, this is the summation of a whole load of work, and you either do well or you don't, and if you don't, tough. And I would go along with Bista and agree that learnification over the last 20 years has been a real problem, where the teacher is sidelined in a sense. But in a recent paper that he's written, he talks about the soft power of the teacher, that the teacher shouldn't be authoritarian, that it isn't a choice between a sort of a traditional direct transmission method or discovery learning and learnification, but actually as he talks about in the quote on this slide. It's the idea that the teacher should play a pivotal role, but actually in the knowledge and the discussion and the dialogue that's transmitted, if you like, in a sense. Rather than it being one way, it becomes two-way. It becomes a dialogue, and it's actually about getting away from what he calls an egological approach to teaching and learning. In other words, the more sort of learnification style, where the individual just decides what's important for them and the world evolves around them. This is about opening up to individuals, the world to them, and allowing them to understand their place within the world and having different lenses to critically assess the world around them, so that the curriculum and teaching becomes far more one, not of making the student the object, but making them the subject. So it's the soft power of the teacher. To finish off, we need to see education in a far wider context. This is just some sort of random thoughts that I'm beginning to put together, but the idea of sort of complex pedagogy linking into knowledge and understanding, linking in to some ways to complexity reduction. Whenever we're involved in complex processes, we'll always reduce to a certain extent, but it's wrong, in my opinion, to reduce it so much that we start talking about things like best practice. It's wrong within complex pedagogies to only rely on numeric data. And we need to begin to think about, sort of over towards the left-hand side of this diagram, how education feeds into people and community, both within and beyond the school. How participation, both informal and formal, become a more central element of what we're attempting to do. That actually things like trust should be part of accountability, but also that we need to think about policy and not allow policy to become focused on complexity reduction, but to actually harness and consider the complexity of the process we're involved in. And therefore, at a very large scale, education has to have far more explicit links to the environmental, the social, the cultural, the economic issues that are going on in society, not in trite ways where we just have student debates, but actually thinking about how those things are enfolded in a serious way into the educative process. So just some final thoughts to finish off, really. By focusing too much on the neoliberal, we actually begin to fixate on that, and we actually fail to imagine other things. And in spending all of our time critiquing and saying how appalling and trying to build that evidential base of how appalling, it actually sustains the neoliberal narrative. We have to let it go to a certain extent and actually do something positive instead. We need to create alternatives as a consequence, but they have to be considered, they have to be evidenced, and they have to be coherent. So they're not things that we can put together rapidly. They're things that we need to develop over time. And as a consequence, we need to create debates and discussion, and we need to move in an emergent fashion towards different ideas that actually have some real substance at their hearts. I would argue that education is a complex process, and that not only is it complex in its own right, but it's part of a much wider socio-environmental series of systems, and we need to think in more holistic ways. Educationalists often are very good at talking to educationalists, but they much more rarely actually look beyond education as a process. And therefore we need to talk more about how education relates to those processes, and how actually we can begin to see education as being embedded in those wider complex systems to help begin to bring positive changes at all scales, from the individual up to the national and beyond. So I would argue as a parting thought, really, that what we actually need to do is to begin to work with this complexity, begin to understand it and characterize it and systematize it. And that we have to admit that in doing so we are actually leading to complexity reduction itself. We can't actually capture the full complexity of what it is we're looking at, but actually better that than convince ourselves through reductive ways of seeing the world that somehow we understand most of it and we can function with a great degree of control. In other words, it's better to work with the complexity rather than with the shadows. And over during the presentation.